Good afternoon. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. I want to thank you for joining us virtually for this fourth installment of our 2024 Mexico election series, Mexico's Pathways Forward for Framing the Next Sexenio. As part of the series, last week we met with leading foreign policy advisors for both of the top two candidates, Ildefonso Guajardo and Diana Alarcón, in which we discussed security, bilateral trade ties, economic enhancements, border opportunities. That conversation was also shaped by recommendations from a newly released Atlantic Council report titled Commercial Pathways Forward for Mexico 2024-2030 that highlights the future of two key aspects of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, two areas in which the Atlantic Council has spent significant time, commercial flows and investment. And you can read the full report on the Atlantic Council website. Today, I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation with our event journalist report preview of Mexico's June 2 elections. As all of you watching know, we are experiencing in the midst of an incredibly pivotal moment in Mexico's history. The elections this coming weekend are set to be the largest and most consequential ever, with over 100 million Mexicans registered to vote. The sheer scale of this election, we have more than 20,000 federal, state, and local offices up for grabs, including the presidency, the entire Congress, which includes 128 Senate seats and 500 Chamber of Deputies seats, as well as 8 governorships. And then, of course, the race for Mexico's first female president, which will signify a critical moment for the country's political landscape. The outcome of the elections have the opportunity to address critical issues that are facing the country, from security and corruption to economic equality and other key items. Today, I have the privilege of having the tables turned. Because instead of being interviewed by journalists, I will be moderating the conversation with top journalists who have been closely following and reporting on developments in Mexico. Their insights and analysis, I'm sure many of you read or watch regularly. They will help us to understand the dynamics of Mexico's political landscape, as well as what to expect this weekend and outcomes for the bilateral relationship. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by a few longtime friends and new friends. JP Spinetto. JP is the columnist for Latin American affairs with Bloomberg Opinion. He was previously Bloomberg News's managing editor for economics and government in the region, and also covered commodities and energy industries for Bloomberg News in Rio. So JP, welcome. Great to have you here at the virtual Atlantic Council.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. We're also joined by Christine Murray. Christine is the Mexico and Central America correspondent for the Financial Times. She previously spent years at Reuters and at the Thomson Reuters Foundation in London, New York, and Mexico City. She's been with the Financial Times in Mexico for 2.5 years now, but as I mentioned, has spent significant time in Mexico previous to that. She's covered a number of different beats, from companies to trafficking, and is now very much focused on politics and economics in the region. So Christine, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Jason.
And I'm also joined by Sergio Sarmiento. Sergio is a well-known, well-respected Mexican journalist. He writes for Reforma. He is on with TV Azteca, as well as Televisa. And as Sergio and I were speaking prior to this event, not only the only person now, but the only person in history to be on both TV Azteca. I have concurrent shows on TV Azteca and Televisa, and with Televisa on with one of the most prominent political news shows that the network has. So Sergio, I know many of us are closely follow your work, and great to have you on here with us.
Thank you, Jason, and it's a pleasure to be with two journalists I admire, Christine and JP.
Fantastic. Well, this is quite an excellent group. I want to thank you all from the public for joining us today. This conversation, of course, is not only timely, but it's essential because it comes right before the election. It comes as there are last-minute developments. We're actually going to end. It's 4 or 5 p.m. here in Washington. It's 2:05 p.m. in Mexico City. We're going to end precisely on time because All three of my guests have to then go to the Zocalo for final campaign rallies. As you're watching today's conversation, please feel free to submit questions, and you can submit those questions, go online to askac.org, and there to submit your questions, which we will take over the course of the conversation. So let me begin with you, JP. The high stakes of the elections, both presidential, national elections, subnational. How do you foresee election outcomes shaping Mexico's landscape over the next sexennial? What in particular, what are you watching for this weekend? And what are the key things that you're going to be particularly looking at as voters go to the polls on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. This election, some people said that it's a foregone conclusion, starting by Claudia Sheinbaum herself, who called the election a trámite, right? Like a final paperwork that she needs to become president. And I think that's a wrong approach. I think this is very consequential election. I'll be watching, like everybody of you, the difference between Claudia and Xochitl. And, the local races are going to be very important. The fact of how strong will be each party in Congress. There is a slight chance that Morena gains a supermajority in Congress. That will be a really big issue. It will change things dramatically, I think. Chances of that happening are very low, but it's something that we'll be watching. I think, the fact that everybody expects Claudia to win this election, and certainly that's the case, is for her to lose, hides a bit the dramatic change in political terms that Mexico is going through. AMLO has been a unique president in several ways, and now we're going to start a new chapter that is going to be very different, I feel, and it's going to be, it's a question mark in a lot of sense. One of the secrets of this election is there are not too many differences among these three candidates, at least in their ideology. The three of them could be described as center-left, maybe, but they represent very different political projects. And we don't know, in the case of Claudia Sheinbaum, if she wins, as everybody expects, how is she going to govern? How much is she going to divert from the path that AMLO has set for her? Or, if she decides to stick to that route, how she's going to do with all the things that Mexico needs to change, like security, like low growth, like, poor services, like education and health. These are big question marks. And I think, we're going to know it starting on Sunday. The final point is, if we have a surprise and Xochitl wins, that's going to be also a big question mark, because in any case, Morena will be very strong. And, we don't have experiences of Mexico of these coalition governments. Yeah. So, in any case, we're starting a new chapter here.
Thank you, JP. Let me turn to you, Sergio. We were discussing the polls. If you could maybe walk us through a little bit what you're seeing in some of these polls as we're heading into the weekend, presidential level, what you're foreseeing. JP mentioned the importance of Congress, what you're seeing at a congressional level, and maybe even some of the key governorships.
Okay, there's no doubt that Claudia is ahead. Claudia, the official party, the government party's candidate, Claudia is ahead by a large margin. Today, there was the last group of polls that were legally allowed to be published. The Reforma, which is probably the most important newspaper in Mexico, is giving Claudia a 20-point advantage, 55% against 35%, with 10% for Jorge Alvarez Maínez, who's in third place. That's a 20-point advantage that, even if public opinion polls have been known to not be very reliable over the past few years in Mexico and other countries of the world, it's such a huge advantage that it's very difficult to think that there might be a surprise on Sunday. So I'm expecting Claudia to win. And it's not so much that Claudia is a charismatic politicians such as Andrés Manuel López Obrador, but she has the full support of López Obrador, and he retains a popularity of about or close to 70%, and that has made it very easy for his candidate, Claudia, to be in the lead right now. In Congress, public opinion polls, whatever we have, because public opinion polls are not very common in Mexico for Congress because it's very expensive to actually poll 300 electoral districts in the country. But the latest poll or today's poll by Reforma gives Morena, which is the government party, 44%, and two allies, 6%, the Green Party and the Labor Party, 5%. The opposition is getting far less. The PAN is getting, PAN is the National Action Party, conservative party that has ruled Mexico in 2 terms, 21%. The PRI, the former dominant party, is getting only 10%. Movimiento Ciudadano, which is the third party right now, is getting 10% as well. If these results hold on for next Sunday, we will see a simple majority in Congress for Claudia and the ruling party, but just a simple majority, not a majority that would allow them to actually change the constitution. And that's what I think we should be getting at the end of the process. Claudia Sheinbaum is the first female president in Mexican history, a leftist. I mean, she was actually a far left activist when she was younger. It's very hard to know what political position she has right now, because she has merely repeated whatever the president says every day. She repeats it that afternoon, and that has been her whole campaign, to claim that she is going to continue the policies of President López Obrador. Morena will have a hold on Congress that will be able to change whatever secondary legislation they want, but they will not be able to change the Constitution. And part of what President López Obrador wanted for this election was to be able to change the Constitution at will, to eliminate an independent judicial system. He doesn't like when courts oppose whatever occurrence he happens to have in that very moment.
Did we walk us through, before I go over to Chris, some of the key governorships?
Sure. Mexico City, which is where everyone is looking at, is very likely to be won by the government, by Morena. Clara Brugada is the candidate. Jalisco will be won very likely, although the race there is very tight, by Pablo Lemos, who is from Movimiento Ciudadano, the third party. Guanajuato will be won by the PAN, which is actually ruling that state right now. Morelos is very likely to be won by Morena. Yucatan will be won by the National Action Party. Chiapas will be won by Morena. Veracruz is very likely to be won by Morena as well. Aguascalientes by the PAN. So we're going to see a stalemate, in the sense that nobody seems at this point able to actually wrest away any state from their opponents, and of course Mexico City, which is very crucial, and where the opposition thought that they could actually have a win. According to the Reforma poll that was published yesterday, the government candidate Clara Brugada has a 10-point advantage. Can the polls be wrong? Yes, they can be wrong. Have they been wrong? Yes, they have been wrong. Is it likely that they are wrong 10 or 20 points? Very unlikely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sergio. Now, Chris, I'm now going to ask you, what do you agree with the what you've heard so far? JP's layout of the election, Sergio's insofar as the different key governorships, Congress, obviously the presidency, and also kind of what are the implications from your perspective? Sergio and JP were talking about the importance of the simple majority versus the super majority and Congress, and how key that is to governability, and what the next president will seek insofar as support from that from the congressional body for key changes. what else are you looking at as we're approaching the weekend that the international community should be aware of that are on the top minds of Mexican voters?
Thanks, Jason. So I think I'd just say that the candidates themselves are framing this election in quite dramatic terms. So, the opposition candidate, Xochitl Gálvez, is framing it as sort of choice of democracy and authoritarianism. The ruling party candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum, is framing it as, a return to corruption versus the transformation, which is what the President López Obrador calls his political project, centered around help for the poor via social programs, raising the minimum wage. And this is obviously all happening at quite an important economic moment for Mexico when it has this opportunity. It seems it's in this sort of lucky position of being a potential beneficiary of the US-China trade war. The candidates have laid out some ideas that seem similar, but they also, as JP alluded to, have very different backgrounds. I think, regardless of what the plans that the candidates have say, the reality is that whoever wins the presidency, at least, is going to face some pretty big short-term challenges as soon as this year. I'm sure we'll get into them later, but the public finances challenge, choosing a new Supreme Court judge, how to structure investment from this nearshoring opportunity that I mentioned before, and particularly in the electricity sector. So I think, certainly if you listen to how the candidates are framing it, it's the political system, the future of the political system in the US's #1 trading partner that is going to be, decided or, heavily influenced by what happens on Sunday. And again, as both Sergio and JP mentioned, what happens in Congress is going to be very crucial. So whoever wins, how do they win? What kind of majority do they have? If the ruling party coalition wins and is able to win a supermajority, which the polls suggest isn't likely, that definitely changes the calculation for the 20 constitutional reforms that the president sent to Congress earlier this year, some of which would radically alter Mexico's institutions that have been sort of being built over the last 30 years. And so I'd say that, there's definitely a lot at stake. And when you talk to voters, like a lot of voters realize that too, regardless of who they're going to vote for. So I think people are expecting quite high participation in these elections.
And Chris, in your coverage from the FT, your focus on economics, the financial markets in Mexico, you mentioned nearshoring. I mean, how do investors look at the congressional vote? The simple majority versus the off chance, but there's still a chance of a super majority. What is more appealing for investment opportunities in Mexico?
So I think that it's fair to say the mainstream view among economic analysts is that, and investors watching markets, is that Morena and the ruling coalition won't get a supermajority. And so kind of the assumptions that people are making are based on that. So if that were to happen, those assumptions would change. And obviously the main question then would be what happens to institutions like the Supreme Court. So the president has proposed electing the judges of the Supreme Court directly, along with a series of other important changes. And certainly investors are paying very close attention to that. And regardless, even if the ruling coalition doesn't win a supermajority, what happens to those institutions is very important to people investing in Mexico.
Yeah. Very, very important point that economic forecasts, economic projections are taking into account the simple majority. The off chance of a supermajority would very much sway some of those calculations. Sergio, let me go back to you before JP. This election also important because of the recent reforms at the National Electoral Institute at the INE. How are you seeing that impacting the public confidence in the election process, especially as we approach the election on Sunday?
Well, actually, the president tried to dismantle the National Electoral Institute, the INE, but he failed. So there weren't really major reforms. What he has tried to do and has partially succeeded in doing is putting loyalists, Morena sympathizers in key positions within the INE. Even the president of the INE right now, Guadalupe Tadei, comes from a family of sympathizers of Morena. It's never been, of course, easy to be an arbiter, to be the referee in Mexican elections, but the point is that INE so far has done a pretty good job. They've been very weak. They're not as strong as they used to be with Lorenzo Córdoba as president of the institution. For example, President López Obrador actually broke the rules of the game by starting the pre-campaigns before he was legally allowed to do that, and INE was enabled. They weren't able to get the votes to actually stop him from doing that. But I think by and large, INE remains an independent institution because the president failed in its attempt to actually destroy the institution. Their decisions have been reasonably within the law so far, and I expect the present INE to be an independent, reliable referee for the national elections. It's the same thing with the Electoral Tribunal. The president tried to destroy it. He hasn't allowed 2 new magistrates to be nominated because he thinks that there shouldn't be independent electoral institutions. He believes that the government should do election judging as it was done in Mexico in the past, when the PRI, the dominant party for decades, was in charge of actually establishing the rules and determining whether the parties were actually abiding or not by the rules. So far, however, I believe that we continue to have institutions, electoral institutions, both the INE and Electoral Tribunal, that are reasonably independent. And of course, since everything seems to indicate that the official candidate will win the election and the ruling party will actually keep control of Congress, I don't expect it to be too troublesome for anyone. López Obrador has never accepted a defeat. He claimed fraud in every election that he lost. And he has said that the only 2 clean elections that he's had are the 2 elections that he won, both in Mexico City in the year 2000, in 2018 with presidential race. Every other election that he's lost, he's claimed that there was fraud against him.
Sergio, I was an election observer in 2006.
Yes.
Mexico. So I remember that evening when the prep results and then the official results came in. I think maybe part of the challenge, sometimes it can be confusing for those who are less familiar with Mexico's electoral system, how the prep works versus how the official results work. But I've always been very impressed with at that time the IFE, but with the Mexican electoral system and the
what people don't know, Jason, is that what the prep has are not the real votes that are going to be counted. The vote counting is actually on Wednesday after the election. The prep it just gives you an indication. But the votes that are counted, on Sunday within every precinct, electoral precinct, and then the results are sent to the district offices. And in the district offices, all of the results are counted, and those are the official results. The prep is just an indication that is based on what results are arriving. It's not stratified. It's not statistically filtered so that one candidate might be winning at one point and then he might end up losing because there's no it's not a quick count. There's the quick count, which is totally different. But you're right, Jason, our system is so complicated that a lot of people just don't understand what's happening, and that of course makes it easy to claim that there was an electoral fraud at the end. And that's what actually López Obrador did in 2006. I was, of course, covering the election as I've covered every election since '76. And I can tell you that there was no fraud, but the President López Obrador continues to claim that there was a fraud.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good message for all of our viewers is before analyzing the results on Sunday, study up how the Mexican electoral system works, because it's a great system, but it's also complicated.
Yeah, good luck to them. It is very complex.
Now, JP, during our conversation with advisors to both the Sheinbaum and Galvez campaigns last week, we discussed the potential what needs to be happening on the security front, right? A key issue, in on bilateral relations. Of course, the top topic at the last presidential debate as well. Issues of illicit trafficking, fentanyl, precursor chemicals. From your perspective, what should be some of the approaches that candidates should be putting out there to increase security at the U.S.-Mexico border and beyond, given the importance of security as a topic both of top concern for Mexican voters, but also as a top concern on the from the U.S. side on the bilateral relationship. Oh, I think we lost JP just as I was asking him that question. So we'll put it on hold for a second. Let me go back to you, Chris. Chris, we were talking about Mexico's economy beforehand. The economy has been showing some signs of slowing growth, about 0.3% in the last quarter of the previous year of 2023, according to the Dallas Fed. How are candidates leveraging their platforms to discuss economic growth, existing trade policy? You mentioned previously USMCA. This is going to be a pivotal issue for the next president, since we have the review period for USMCA under the next sexenio. How are you seeing candidates leveraging their platforms? Where are you seeing potential differences, and how are you looking at the vote this weekend?
So both candidates say they understand the need for economic growth. Mexico has had disappointing economic growth for decades now. There's a complicated series of factors to do with productivity, and lots of different theories as to why. But both candidates, leading presidential candidates, say that this matters. I would say the most immediate challenge that they're going to face is public finances, because this year, as we speak, the budget for next year is being drawn up, and the next budget will have to include a 3 percentage point cut in spending to meet the target that was set out by the finance ministry. And that will happen, theoretically, as the economy is already slowing down, inflation is still persistent. Doing that maneuver is going to be complicated for whoever wins. And at the same time, there is a lot of investor interest in Mexico. There's a lot of enthusiasm, but foreign direct investment has remained solid and continued to sort of grow at a reasonable pace, but there's not really signs of a massive boom that some say could be happening. So they'll have to manage a difficult public finances situation with a slowing economy and try to grab onto as much of that investment as they can. Claudia Sheinbaum said she wants to build 100 new industrial parks in specific areas of the country, and accelerate the transition to renewable energy. So I think people are just waiting to see the details of what that actually will look like. And Xochitl Gálvez has said, that she thinks the nearshoring opportunity is passing Mexico by, and has sort of indicated that she would be more open and more friendly to private investment. But as you mentioned, USMCA, the trade deal between Mexico, Canada, and the US underscores it's sort of the floor that supports a lot of that investment. And so how the next president handles the review of the trade deal coming up in 2026 is crucial. And I think, when the candidates have been asked about it, they seem to understand that that is one of the most important decisions and processes that they'll have to manage, because it is a process that takes years. And that's sort of, as I said, the floor of investment, whereas the upside for investment is going to be things like the supply of electricity, infrastructure, water. So there's quite a long list of kind of problems and issues that they'll have to take on quite quickly.
Chris, you mentioned the 3% cut in spending that the next president will oversee as part of the budget for the upcoming budget. We had here recently the finance secretary Rogelio Ramirez de la O, and during a recent trip to Washington, and he explained that the cut in spending was partly because of the cyclical nature of the budget, right? That there have been spending, and you can't keep spending at a certain level, and so thereby rather than kind of a cut per se, it's more of kind of like I'm paraphrasing him, but more of like a balancing out of the budget to a degree.
So there is some amount of the deficit that is explained by finishing big infrastructure projects this year that are the priority for the president. But the analysts that I've spoken to estimate that's around 1 percentage point of the 3. There are sort of reasonable arguments as to exactly how much it represents, but there's definitely an additional amount of cutting spending or increasing income that would be needed.
Yeah. Thank you. I see JP is back. So JP, you happened to leave just as I was asking a question.
Sorry, guys, my brand new laptop collapsed. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's why I haven't changed my laptop in years. I was asking about the security questions that have come up during the campaign, and security being a top issue in the last debate as well, a top concern among voters. Actually, Christine, you had a piece just the other day about mentioning security and how that's a top priority for middle class Mexican voters. JP, from your perspective, what should be some of the issues raised? What other approaches have been raised by the candidates to increase security? And not only what other approaches have been raised, but also what other approaches should be raised or should have been raised by the candidates, or what are approaches that you're looking to for the next presidency to help to address some of the security concerns that have played front and center as part of the campaign.
I think it's fascinating that on one side, it's clearly a demand from voters. People are very worried. It's one of the top issues that voters are having in mind. At the same time, to my surprise, we didn't see a Bukele type candidate, right? And that led to Xochitl trying to walk a very fine line between, showing a tougher approach and at the same time not presenting a project like what Claudia is offering, right? Claudia is offering, say, something like, well, let's address again the issue of the abrazos no balazos, right? Mm-hmm. The issue of how we, as President López Obrador has promised, how we tackle the root causes of insecurity and violence. The reality is that strategy didn't work, but the alternative that we are hearing aren't great either. So my perception is that anything that will be done here has to be done in coordination with the U.S. It's a very important topic for both countries. The issue of drugs and the issue of how we see this mixed with organized crime, with migration. This is a massive topic. And again, what we hear from Claudia Sheinbaum is not very different from what AMLO has been arguing all these years, right? That we need to give opportunities to people, give opportunities to especially youngsters to try to avoid that path of violence. Now, the issue, as I see it, is that these organized crimes are very sophisticated multinationals, right? They make billions and billions of dollars every year. And I would have liked to see a more realistic approach from that side, from that perspective. Is not everything has to be a Bukele type approach. You can take things like going after money laundering, right? This money that we're talking about, there's billions and billions of dollars. Is, as we reporters say, follow the money. This money comes back into both economies. And here I'm not saying, I think the other issue that I think is very important is for the U.S. to realize this is not Mexico's problem only. It's both countries' problems, right? So there has to be a lot of cooperation, but also there has to be a realization from the U.S. side that it's not just narco lords hidden in Sinaloa, right? These drugs arrive to U.S. cities there by very sophisticated logistic systems. They're distributed, their money flows everywhere, and the U.S. also has to do a lot. And finally, I've been a bit obsessed, so I'm going to mention this topic because there is a lot that we can do, especially in the media, to explain the big damage that this drugs abuse do to countries in Latin America, right? It's very ironic and that you see in the US this obsession for a healthier life, right? We drink our green juices and, we go to the gym and all of this, but at the same time, nobody speaks about the tremendous damage that drugs pose to our communities in Latin America.
Yeah, thank you, JP. Good points. Sergio, let me go back to you. Continuing on the topic of security and your deep knowledge of Mexican politics, what's the opportunity? What's the run room for the next president, working potentially with the next Congress? You went through at the beginning the different governor races across the country. With the results that you're expecting, what do you see insofar as the opportunities to better address some of the security challenges that have been, front and center as part of the campaign?
Well, I see some hope in one fact. Claudia Sheinbaum's security person is Omar Garcia Harfuch, who's Secretary of Security in Mexico City for almost the entire administration. And he is a professional policeman. He comes from a political family, but he has been a professional policeman since he was very young, in his early 20s. He's worked for different governments, for different parties. He's always done a good job, in my opinion. And I think he was a good Secretary of Security in Mexico City. Homicides went down almost 50% during his tenure here in Mexico City, which was very dangerous for various reasons: kidnaps, murders in the 1980s, for example, has become one of the safest cities in Mexico at this point. It's very hard to know exactly what they're going to do because Claudia is very careful not to antagonize President López Obrador. López Obrador has always claimed that his philosophy was hugs and not bullets, although that wasn't quite true in reality. The fact is that attempts to arrest drug dealers, attempts to reduce violence have continued under military leadership, but they've continued. However, when when Claudia Sheinbaum was the mayor of Mexico City and she chose Omar Garcia Harfuch as her Secretary of Security, there was a lot of pressure on her to choose a military person to be the secretary, and she actually fought for Omar Garcia Harfuch, for a professional policeman who'd worked for both the PAN and the PRI, the opposition parties. She was very much criticized by all of her fellow members of Morena. She kept Omar Garcia Harfuch in the position, and I think he's done a good job. The situation, the violence and the security situations in Mexico are very complex. They're not very easy to solve. We've had that problem for a number of years, and we've had it with different parties in power. But I have the idea that Omar Garcia Harfuch is the right person to be in charge of security, a professional policeman, in case Claudia actually wins the elections next Sunday. To me, that's a good point when I look forth to the future of Mexico in terms of security. And I do believe both the drug trade, but also violence, which is related to the drug trade, have become the most important issues in Mexico today.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sergio. Chris, let me go back to you. And we talked previously on USMCA, and I'd like to get your further thoughts. This is going to be one of the key issues, security, of course, one of them, in the bilateral relationship, but also the review of USMCA. The concern about the increase in Chinese investment in Mexico, what that means for North America, as well as the discussion to which some of the dispute settlement mechanisms have been working, and the degree to which they some of the kind of how to make those mechanisms work even better as part of the agreement. How do you assess kind of the ability of kind of the readiness of either presidential candidate to and their economic teams to sit down with the United States and obviously with Canada as well as part of that review clause for USMCA? And what would you like to flag insofar as maybe some of the key priorities that we should be watching out for regarding that review period?
So I think the first thing I'd say is that what happens in the US-Mexico relationship is probably more up to the US electorate at this stage. I think, and that is also, whether in the US election, President Joe Biden or Donald Trump wins, the relationship, will likely evolve. And so, the US's own approach to the USMCA review, how much protectionism do they, have and want to focus on in those talks will be obviously very important with regard to what happens. I think, in general, the relationship, if Claudia Sheinbaum were to win, as the polls suggest, she has clearly signaled continuation in terms of the US relationship. When she's been asked about China, for example, she said, we'll maintain a relationship as we do with other countries, but that the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement is fundamental. So, clearly she's underlining the priority of the US relationship. And I think in my conversations here with a lot of people, I think that's something broadly, understood or agreed upon. I know Xochitl Gálvez, the opposition candidate, has talked about sort of recuperating the US-Mexico relationship, arguing it's been damaged, particularly around security cooperation. But in general, I think Mexican politicians understand that there's a lot of concern about China's influence in Mexico, but that the kind of numbers involved in terms of investment, for example, are still relatively low. And so I think, were Claudia Sheinbaum to win, she signaled kind of broad continuity on that front. And has said that, they're already working on, the USMCA review. The team understands that that's important. So I think Mexico's always had, it's kind of been known for having strong trade negotiating teams. I think there are some have questions about, what's happened in the last 5 years under this government to those teams, and the kind of talent that there is in the government. But there are plenty of people in Mexico's private sector as well who have lots of experience negotiating trade deals. So yeah, I think it's just important to say that that's already beginning now. So those talks are already happening, and whoever wins, they're going to have to pick this up pretty much straight away.
And Chris, as you're speaking about USMCA, go back to, and I'm gonna go back to you here on JP. But for those who are watching, the Atlantic Council, we're a global organization. There's probably people watching today that are not just closely following Mexico on a day-to-day basis, but more concerned about what does this election mean from the broader global perspective and broader global shifts, and what is this? Well, from your perspective, why is this election this weekend so important, even if you're a viewer of this broadcast that doesn't really focus on Mexico? Why is the Mexico relationship in the global community, specifically with the U.S. North American perspective? Why do these results, matter from a broader perspective? I have my reasons as well, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Listen, I was a bit surprised about the amount of stories and really great analysis we saw in the past 2 weeks, including by Chrissy and Sergio, and a lot of outlets in the international media talking about the future of Mexico with very different angles, right? As Chrissy was saying, some people are saying the future of democracy in Mexico is at stake in this election. I don't believe that, but certainly there are arguments to be made along those lines. I think Mexico is a very important country for several reasons. It's the largest trading partner with the U.S. It's one of the largest industrial powerhouses in the world. It's the largest Spanish-speaking country. It has a key role, in my opinion, to play in Latin America that has been abandoned by AMLO in these 6 years. That's something that we'll have to see if that changes with Claudia Sheinbaum or with Xochitl Gálvez. But I think Mexico should recover that role of trying to intermediate between the U.S. and South America. 83% of all the exports that Mexico sends goes to the U.S. And what we have seen in the past years is that this relationship is every time more U.S.-centric. The European Union-Mexico trade agreement is stalled. It only needed the final signature, but it's stalled now. And I think there are other several reasons like migration and all these other big topics that make this election very, very important. As I said before, it's not just who's winning this election, but the political configuration we're going to see in the future. And this has to do with the low growth that the new president will get. Some estimates by the IMF says that Mexico is growing only 1.4% this year after growing only 1% on average per year during the AMLO administration. The fiscal problems that Chrissy was mentioning, I don't believe that you can do a 3% fiscal adjustment as the finance minister is saying, simply because that would mean, a contraction in the economy. Mm-hmm. So how the new president is going to do that adjustment and what it's going to mean for the U.S. relationship and the trading relationship with the rest of the region, I think that's another reason why this election is very important.
Sergio, one point that JP mentioned we haven't talked about yet, and I'm going to bring in, we have one question from the audience. So if you're listening and you have a question, please submit your question to askac.org. But migration. And Chris made the excellent point that in many ways, things like USMCA is more going to be determined based on who wins the election in the United States in November. But on the migration perspective, how do you see the next president working through the politics within Mexico, but then also the bilateral relationship on the U.S. side with the next administration here, to be able to best address the different but oftentimes overlapping concerns between the U.S. and Mexico on how to deal with the the spike in migration. As we know, the migration coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, it's migrants coming from all across the Americas and transiting through Mexico. But how do you see the next president working through kind of Mexico's migration policy in the next sexenio, and some of the political calculations that will be thought of as the president is seeking to have a policy that balances Mexican interests, but also balances the interests of the bilateral relationship with the United States?
Jason, I don't see any changes in Mexico's migratory policies, regardless of who wins the elections. I think Claudia will keep, the present policies, which were not actually chosen by López Obrador at first. Xochitl claims that she will pay more attention to human rights, but it's not that easy to do. Let me go back to what López Obrador did at the beginning of his administration. He claimed publicly that he was going to open up the doors of Mexico for everyone who wanted to come. And in fact, he did provoke a number of caravans that came to Mexico wanted to go into the U.S. Eventually, Donald Trump put pressure on the Mexican government and said to them that he was going to close the U.S.-Mexico border. And even López Obrador, in spite of all of the way he looks at the world, I realized that this was going to be an economic tragedy for Mexico. So he started to use the National Guard to stop migrants from coming through Mexico and going to the U.S. But of course, that's easier said than done. It's very difficult to stop it. And Mexico just doesn't have the police forces, the migratory agents. We don't have a border patrol. We have really no instruments to actually stop the flow of migrants coming from south of Mexico. But also, we're getting a revival of Mexicans going abroad for to work and trying to get into the United States illegally. That had actually disappeared during the administrations, especially during the administration of Felipe Calderón, and also a little bit during the government of Enrique Peña Nieto. The net inflow of Mexicans to the U.S. was actually negative. More Mexicans were coming back to Mexico than Mexicans were were going to the U.S. That has reversed again. Now there's a large number of Mexicans that are trying to cross the border to the U.S. And of course that is a very complex problem, but I don't see any changes in our migratory policy. We will continue to try to stop the migrants come to Mexico. We will not be able to do that. We will continue to see a very large flow of Mexicans going to the U.S. And if Donald Trump wins the election next November, this will likely generate a major conflict between Mexico and the U.S. because, of course, Trump blames Mexico for immigration in the U.S. just as he blames Mexico for the drug trade in the U.S. Well, of course, it is probably a shared responsibility, but for Trump, it's very easy. I mean, he needs a guilty party, and the guilty party will always be Mexico. So I don't expect any major changes in trends of migratory workers being encountered, as they say now, in the southwest U.S. border. But I do see a probable change of policy in the U.S. if Donald Trump wins the November elections.
Thank you, sir. Here, I'm going to ask a question. Anyone in any of the panelists can take this question. It comes from askac.org, which notes that in previous elections, foreign intervention has been a concern, and whether this is something that you're seeing this time around. If so, how is it being addressed? We do monitoring of misinformation and disinformation from the Atlantic Council, from our our Digital Forensic Research Lab, working collaboratively with local partners. A lot of that in the last election in 2018. So, but curious what you're seeing or concerns anybody has noted insofar as increases or decreases in any kind of foreign intervention intent, specifically with regard to information flows around the election.
Well, if no one wants to answer, I will. I think there's always attempts to meddle in elections, even in U.S. elections. We saw that from Russia in the two last elections. Whatever meddling there is, and I'm sure there are political organizations in the U.S. that want to that's supporting certain parties and causes. Russia has always wanted to meddle, and they do have their information weapons. They have RT, which is a popular channel in Mexico, and they have the ways to actually try to generate false accounts in Facebook and other social media. But from what I can see, there is no significant effects on these attempts by foreign countries to actually change the Mexican election. In the end, we Mexicans will decide who's going to be our next government.
I'm going to ask a last question. We have about 4 more minutes. I promise to end on time because all of our panelists have to leave precisely at 5 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Mexico. What might be a surprise that we have not talked about over the course of the last hour that you're thinking about watching out for this coming weekend? I'll start with you, JP.
To me, a surprise would be one of the candidates not conceding or not accepting the results. That would be, if we have a tighter than expected election, maybe, either side is tempted not to recognize the results, especially given the experience of AMLO on the topic.
Chris?
Yeah, I would say Mexico City. So what happens to the mayoralty here? The polls do say that suggest that Clara Brugada of the ruling party will win, but it's much closer than the presidential race, and there have been a lot of big issues affecting Mexico City, particularly water, for the last few months. The electricity issues there've been, and we saw in 2021 when Morena lost several districts in the city that it can change hands. So after decades of left-leaning parties in power, it'll be interesting to see whether the opposition manages to win the city. I'd say paying close attention to Mexico City.
Thanks, Chris. Sergio.
Yeah, to me, the biggest or the most feared surprise for next Sunday would be an increase in the wave of political violence that we've been experimenting in Mexico. This has been, even though I can't really fathom President López Obrador. He said yesterday that he was expecting to have the cleanest election and the most peaceful election in history. Well, we've already had the most violent election in history. We've seen a number of murders. Well, recognized by the government, 22 murders of candidates. But if you consider everyone else who is not a candidate, we actually have more than maybe 2 or 3 dozen murders of political people over the past few months. And I'm afraid that something else could happen in terms of violence on Sunday. We've had violence in the past in elections, but what I have seen over the past 2 or 3 months is an increasing wave of violence that, of course, makes me very fearful and very nervous. And we could have a surprise in terms of violence. A major candidate could be killed. I hope it doesn't happen, but that could be a major surprise for next Sunday.
Well, we'll all be praying that surprise does not occur this coming weekend. I want to go ahead and again thank our 3 speakers. Thank you so much for taking an hour of your time at such a pivotal moment. Sergio Sarmiento, Christine Murray, and JP Spinetto. Also a reminder to our viewers on Monday morning on June 3rd, if you're still a little blurry-eyed from watching the results, You can tune in at 9 a.m. Washington, 7 a.m. Mexico City for our virtual event post-election rundown from Mexico's markets to broader transition priorities, where we'll look at what actually occurred on Sunday and what that means moving forward. Of course, we'll still probably be in the process of knowing the results at that point, but it'll be a good check on looking at the day, the previous day. And then on Tuesday, June 5th, if you're here in Washington, you can join us in studio. If not, you can join us virtually for a in-person conversation at 3:30 p.m. Washington, 1:30 p.m. Mexico City, with U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Ken Salazar. He'll join us for his first public comments after the June 2 election. So with that, thank you all again for watching. And again, thank you to our panelists, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.